So welcome everybody. Like the introduction was saying, we are going to talk about monitoring harmful language on social media. The use case that we're going to dive into really is around elections. And like it was indicated already, we did look recently at the election in Nigeria. I also want to take the opportunity to thank our partners that we worked with. There were quite a few partners involved. Obviously, as you will meet in this conversation today as well, CTAD was one of the partners that we worked with. We have YZ on the call today. We have a message pre-recorded from him as well that you will be hearing later. And yeah, I think with that, let's just jump straight into the subject. Now, you have been at the Republica for 2 days already. I don't think I need to spend too much time talking about the fact that we are living in a world that is just so incredibly fast changing. And it really feels for us, like what you see on this video as well, it started off in a way that we could somehow follow it. And then the speed and the scope just caught up. And ultimately, it really ended up for us to be in a situation like this, where we feel we can't manage anymore. It's just getting too much, it's too fast, it's all at once, and it really hits the online discourse as we probably just can't follow it anymore. And I'm pretty sure every one of you is aware of that. That problem that we're facing, that we cannot follow anymore what's happening online. And that really means as well that we can't follow it for the good and for the bad. We're missing on things that we might want to see, but we're also missing out on things that we should be aware of, that we should probably have a view over, and these things are just passing too quickly our time and our eyes, really. So just a quick introduction on who are we. My name is Valerie Khan. I manage Digital Equity Association, the non-profit organization that was managing this project. I'm very happy to have Sanya Orimpera on this stage today as well. She is an Oxford PhD student and also at the Alan Turing Institute. And we have online YZ Yunusa, who is unfortunately not here in person, but he's joining us on the audio. So if you do have any questions later for him, you can ask him. We do have a pre-recording. Oh, perfect. YZ, we see a corner of your head, so at least we get to see your face for a moment there. Perfect. Great. And YZ, if you can maybe just say a word, then we can see as well that you hear us and we can hear you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Valerie, and good evening to everybody. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. That works as well. So wonderful. So with this, I really just want to dive into the presentation quickly. Let me lay out the order of how we plan to do this today. As I said, the idea really is that we want to tackle the question of how can we follow what is happening in today's time, and how can we follow what is happening on the online discourse. Again, we are looking specifically at elections, so you're going to hear a lot about elections, context. YZ will take us time to really walk us through the complexity of the Nigerian electoral space as well, the situation in the country that this election was facing, but also prior elections. It's very, very important in this context to understand really the complexity of what's happening on the ground. Sana will then take over and walk you through the questions of what is really required to do this ethically and in a principled manner. We heard a lot about the use of AI. We have similar worries that maybe things can be used differently, but it's not just a question about AI. There are many things that need to be considered when you're trying to look into the electoral space. So Sana will take the time to walk you through that. We'll give you a brief glimpse on what our findings in Nigeria were, just so that you understand how all of this really came together. But really, most important, we want to finish this with a call to action, and we want to really hear from you. We want to have your ideas as well now and in the future as well. The idea is that this is a process that's only just starting to look into elections and really to look at elections before, during, and after the elections is something that is very, very new still. There is not that much that's happening in that space. Most of it is post-election analysis. We really want to monitor what's happening in the given time. We want to make that transparent to people that can take decisions. And we really look at civil society for this as well. Of course, at state actors as well. These are very sovereign processes, but we really want to understand as well what the civil society space is in this. We focus on monitoring, we focus on creating transparency. I believe that the civil society at large can help to broaden that impact further, take the learnings that we are creating, and then think of how this can ultimately improve the process of elections. So, with this, let me start the recording from YZ so that you understand better what is happening in the Nigeria election process.
Let me start with a brief history of general elections in Nigeria. We had failed republics, 3 of them in the past. And then in 1999, we had returned to civilian rule. And since then, we have had 6 general elections. The last held February, March this year. The general elections actually set up the series of elections that are held in 2 different days. We have the national elections consisting of the presidential election and election to the National Assembly that are held in 1 day. And then we have the governorship election for the 36 states of the Federation, and also membership of the state houses of assembly, also 36. Now for this year's election, we had only election to seats of 28 governors, because others were yet to complete these terms, but also for all the state houses of assembly. There were 28 political parties registered and eligible to contest all these elections. However, in terms of performance and outcome, 5 were more significant, and these were the ruling party, APC, the key opposition party, PDP, the Labour Party, NPP, and APGA. Now, Nigeria has huge diversity in terms of ethnicity and languages. Actually, there are over 400 languages being spoken, and it's also multi-religious. So elections, especially at national level, always present a situation in which political parties have to find a way to provide an inclusive ticket, bringing the different diversities together. And that has always been a complex thing to do because the parameters are mainly language, geography, ethnicity, and so forth. Now, to add to
right, and just this video traveled a long way, so there's a slight time gap here, but he will come back.
All that, they can get to power. Actually, 2 of the high points of this mobilizing was the Not Too Young to Run campaign that took place in 2019 general elections, which lowered the ages for contest, and then the NSAS protest, which shows the anger and frustrations of young people. Now, these young people organize mainly on the social media, and this is not surprising that in the last couple of years, we've seen a steady increase in the proportion of Nigerians who are connected to the internet, meaning that gradually also the number of people who are using social media is increasing. Right now, it's about 31 million people. The choice for this particular election really reduced to three key candidates. One is the candidate of the APC, the ruling party, represented by Bola Ahmed Tinubu, a former governor of Lagos State, and therefore coming from the southwest of the country. The PDP represented Atiku Abubakar from the northeast of the country, and who was a former vice president during Obasanjo's two terms, and then Peter Obi on the platform of Labour Party, who himself was a former governor in Anambra State, as well as a former vice presidential candidate for Atiku Abubakar on the platform of the PDP. Now, what emerged was that each of these three candidates carried a baggage of problems in terms of the national balancing that they needed to do in order to win the elections. For APC, its ticket had come to be termed as Muslim because the presidential candidate and the vice presidential candidate were of the same religious faith, which is a departure from what used to occur when you have the two people from the different faiths on the ticket. For PDP, the challenge was that conventionally, having had the president from the North for 8 years, power should shift to the South, and therefore it needed to produce a candidate from the southern part of the country. But in its presidential primaries, Atiku Abubakar emerged the flag bearer, and that generated tension and conflict and dissent within his own political party, and therefore created discord there. For the Labour Party, I think it was seen as the inheritor of the EndSARS movement and was going to galvanize young people across the country. I remember that the youth constitutes the largest proportion of voters in the country. So if it had focused on that, it would have been able to probably win the election. However, somewhere along the line, the presidential campaign of the Labour Party became enmeshed in identity politics, and that robbed it of the national appeal issue. Now, the baggages that these presidential candidates carried with them during the campaign and the complexity of the Nigerian political space shaped the form of harmful content that we see in the social media, especially Twitter, which appears to be more influential in terms of political communications in the country. Now, remember also that one key feature of Nigerian elections is that it had been always resulted in some form of violence, as this graph shows that in each election, just a few weeks or days to the election, on the election day and immediately after election, they've always resulted in violent conflicts between the opposing political parties. Now, much of that is fed through the spread of harmful content in the social media. So while increasingly social media has come to be accepted as a major campaign tool, in spite of the fact that there are just a few number of users compared to the population of the country, it has become very influential, and I think for two important reasons. One, that there is always a link between offline and online media forms, allowing messages, narratives to cross boundaries and therefore to affect different target audiences. And secondly, social media influencers do also have offline followers who also, because the messages cross to offline media forms, they have access to what they say or what they write in the social media. Now, in spite of that, it has facilitated a campaign communication and therefore serving very useful purpose. It has also been used to spread fake news, rumors, and other harmful contents that tend to catalyze violence or reinforce breakdown of trust across communities. And one particular example that comes to mind is actually the 2011 general elections, in which social media fed into a context of mutual suspicion, leading to massive violence that resulted in the killings of many people during that particular election. Now, given that the social media is double-edged, it's useful for election campaign, but it can also harm the elections. We at Stated thought that it was important to, while making the best of it, try to mitigate the negative consequences of media. And so we, along with IHAP Kenya and Digital Speech project of Beckman Center in the US, pioneered the monitoring of harmful content on social media in the context of election, basically to see what we can do to mitigate against the possible dangers that it presents. That experiment resulted in some key insights, and one of them was that the result of monitoring of harmful content online can be used to preempt or even possibly prevent violence from occurring during the election. Secondly, action aimed at campaign for peaceful election led to decrease in hate speech, strengthening the security of election. In other words, that such an effort is actually practical and useful, real useful things to do. However, two things constrained that experiment. First was that monitoring was manual, covering only a minuscule content of the social media, meaning that we've left a huge spectrum of content unmonitored. And so for this iteration, we thought it was important to look for something that would give us greater coverage of the social media content. And so we opted for AI-based methodology. The second was that in that previous effort, we were concerned more about monitoring what we termed dangerous speech, meaning that we left out other forms of harmful speech, such as inciting, threatening, and so forth. And we thought that it was important to look at this also because they inform the election dynamics in terms of possible violence occurring. And so for this particular iteration, we decided to redefine what we mean by harmful language or harmful content. So thank you very much, and I think my colleague will take over from here.
Perfect. So after that quite detailed description from YC about the Nigerian context, I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about harmful speech and what's our definition that we then sort of expanded on his research to then be used for this project. So we are looking at this space of elections, a centerpiece of democratic processes. And we're interested in capturing disruptive language that somehow harms this idea of free and fair conduct of elections. And like YC described, in our current communications landscape, the volume of these social media posts just is that vast that it necessitates the use of computational approaches. So given that we are looking at textual data and interested in thinking about what is harmful speech, we developed this definition that has 4 different levels. So we are starting with offensive language that contains insults or harassment against an individual, such as an active or former politician, candidate, or electoral institution. We then have another category of hate speech, which is a group-based definition. So here, the message would attack a social group or members of a group based on qualities such as race, ethnicity, gender, nationality, sexual orientation, or disability, for instance. Another category that we included is threatening language. So here, a threat towards an individual or a group with violence, sexual assault, or maybe an unspecified and possibly harmful retribution or reaction. And then finally also calls for violence and whether that is against individual, group, or an institution. And now as we are facing this task of developing somewhat AI-assisted model to be able to look at these texts in this post in social media, we thought that we should wrap this around some sort of principles and tools to make sure that we are doing this ethically and as well as we can. So we developed principles to guide 2 main areas. So first, the use of AI-based tools in monitoring social media, and then also social media monitoring in the specific context of elections. And of course, we live in this world of a very fast-growing array of AI-based tools. I'm sure you've seen a lot of AI-based talks in publica over the past few days. So we wanted to set out principles that would guide us in building a safe and sustainable monitoring tool that fits the needs of these local election managing bodies that of course are serving an electorate that communicates using languages that are underrepresented in many language technologies. And so we developed these 4 sets of principles, and I'm going to walk you through each one very briefly next. So starting with the principles in honoring the electoral context, we thought about 4 areas. So starting with sensitivity to the relevance of elections, and here again, recognizing how important this is for the democratic process, and therefore adhering to high principles, transparency, and responsibility in doing that action of observing elections using AI. Secondly, sensitivity to the electoral audience, so prioritizing the trust and confidence of that general electorate by making sure that our design was very user-centric. We paid attention to public accountability and also ensured accessible communication for both the general public and experts, making sure we accommodated different levels of sort of technological background in that. Then thirdly, sensitivity to national electoral context. So making sure to tailor these AI measures and methods to account for the unique country characteristics. So this could have to do demographic, for instance, ethnic and historical factors. And then finally, of course, independence, demonstrating independence and neutrality away from any political entities in terms of institutional, financial, and leadership. The next set of principles has to do with the design of the AI itself. And here we focused on 3 things. So the explainability of the definition itself, to have a clear and publicly available definition and operationalization of that. Secondly, the explainability of the accuracy, being able to demonstrate how this tool classifies harmful speech, how it might be addressing biases, and then also publishing data on the accuracy of the model. And finally, also the explainability of reliability, making sure that the tool works consistently and it's reliable, validated against possible alternatives. So our third set of principles has to do with data collection and processing. And starting with data collection, of course, to collect this data ethically for the purpose of analyzing election harmful speech, avoiding any commercial use of that or commercial gain, and then maintaining the status of non-public data. Also responsibility in data processing, so consistently, rigorously processing the training data, and then where we were involving human professionals to classify the different types of harmful speech, ensuring high quality, and then also avoiding traumatization or stress of the professionals that were working with us. And finally, in terms of responsible data release, so thinking very carefully what level of data would be released in terms of what detail, and then trying to assess the impact that that in itself would have on the electoral context to avoid unduly influencing voters. And then finally, the set of principles around sustainability, we thought of including 3 different areas, starting with adaptability. So of course, to build the AI system and the technical setup in such a way that it can accommodate adjustments and evolve so that the contextual relevance and responsiveness are ensured. Also including continuous evaluation, so regular and systematic evaluation of the performance of the tools to make sure that they remain effective. And on the other hand, we quickly identify areas for improvement where that is necessary. And then finally, also in terms of transparency and trustworthiness, so of course avoiding any sort of unilateral or opaque adjustments to the tools that could undermine trustworthiness. And then of course making any adjustments transparently to maintain the integrity and credibility of the system. And I think Valerie is now going to talk about some of the findings.
Yeah, so let's have a look briefly at some of the findings. Now obviously this is partially the core of this work, keeping in mind all the principles and the ethical approach that we're applying here. So just to share a couple of examples, what we did find are pretty much the major ones are listed here. Very interestingly, we saw a dynamics in the level of conversation as well. That was like at the beginning of the election, we saw a lot more violent conversations than actually at the election and after the election as well. Although after the election, we saw a lot of dissatisfaction and almost just a withdrawal from the process and a huge level of disappointment, of course, to some level as well. We saw a couple of interesting topics that related directly to candidates and parties. Now, no surprise here, really. However, what we did see that some of these topics actually evolved from outside of Nigeria as well and were then emphasized within Nigeria to some extent, something that we could probably identify as also inauthentic conversations. We saw in the level of hate speech, attacks against ethnic groups, also religious groups that really spread across different geographic areas. It was quite interesting to see how some ethnic groups really were addressed almost exclusively in a harmful manner, whereas other ethnic groups actually were more part of normal conversations. Then, of course, as I mentioned before already, the result of the election after the election was definitely a discussion point. But also we saw that at the beginning of the election as well, that almost a self-fulfilling prophecy that people went into this election similar to what we might hear in other Western elections these days, of going in there by saying, we know the outcome and this is a rigged election. We saw that here as well, the self-fulfilling prophecy element of going in there and saying the outcome is surely not going to be trustworthy, holding open the door to whatever result it ultimately then brings. And then potentially the worst that we saw really is the attacks against the representative authorities. So we have to consider elections are very, very important to build trust for the society at large. I mean, that is the moment of voice for the society. Now, if you attack the authorities, then that's pretty much a loss of trust. And I think at that stage, you're really facing a very, very difficult process to either believe the results of the elections or go into elections again in the future. Now, with this, I really just want to finish with the call to action. And as I said at the beginning, it was our mandate to create transparency around the findings that we could. We now have findings. We have our pockets full, if you want. But of course, all of this is an academic exercise if nothing comes afterwards. So really the idea is that we now start talking effectively about countermeasures. And let me just list a couple here. I'm sure most of you are familiar with a lot of countermeasures that have worked or maybe not worked so well. And the idea really is to figure out now from here, where do we go with it? We have seen a couple of suggestions really with various ideas of what they ultimately target. For us, it is very important that all of this follows a specific plan. So there is a logic to achieving an effective outcome of this as well, because really the spectrum between all the way to blocking accounts and sort of reducing the freedom of speech, that needs to be handled very carefully. So really we see a very good beginning at media and digital literacy before we rush to harsher conclusions. So I'm just going to put up a couple of ideas here that, again, you're probably very familiar starting off with verification, which is typically the debunking, the fact-checking, and then it goes all the way really to the sort of longer-term and more complicated, if you want, elements as well, of working with the platforms, adjusting maybe the economic incentive, let the lie not spread faster than the truth, and then also use this information to now start talking about some really useful and impactful regulations. Trust the information that you'll find and make informed decisions when you talk about regulations. So with this, I would like to draw the conclusion to this presentation. And obviously, if there's any chance that we can still take some questions, I appreciate we're just in time. But if there are any questions, we would be happy to take them either now or you can approach us later. I'll put up a big thank you and also our email addresses. So if you want to get involved, if you want to maybe collaborate, have some ideas on countermeasures, have some civil society impact that you can see in here, we would be more than happy to hear from you as well. So thank you very much. So I don't know if there's question for, if there are questions or time for questions. So you'd have to go to the microphone because we don't have. Oh, yeah. Thank you.
I have a question for YZ. YZ, it seems like this is quite an important tool for you and for Nigeria. Can you talk a little bit about how you'd kind of use the findings now and maybe put this to work for a future election?
Should I respond now?
We can hear you.
Yes,
Go
please.
ahead, yeah.
Right, okay. I think that the use of the material is already a process in the making. First of all, while the elections were ongoing, we were in constant discussion with the election officials, other parties, other agencies who were responsible for peace and so forth. So feeding them with some of the results would help in terms of scaring election materials and election infrastructure so that they are not under threat of destruction. They could also address issues that we see in the conversations. So, for instance, if people are worried about certain actions that INEC had taken, we draw attention to this, and INEC could simply respond if we feel possible. But we could also share the same information to civil society actors who would then use that in terms of advocacy to relevant agencies. So that is using them while the elections were going. But after the election, we sit down and produce policy briefs that would focus on addressing some of the issues that we see, and then getting to interface with the relevant agencies to talk about them and to see what responses can be done. As for the wider population, I think that one of the major things that needed to be done was what Valerie has talked about the countermeasures, and particularly about neutralizing conversation that could catalyze into violence, or whether we needed to counter factual response to those facts, especially when there are misinformation and so forth. I think this is the way we have taken it, and the way that we will continue to engage with the results and to engage with other parties and so forth. The key invitation that we have here is for other actors to also listen to what the results are saying, listen to what the conclusions are, and take appropriate action too. We see a wider space for increased social media literacy, particularly among the citizens, so that they could be immunized against disinformation and hateful content. And we think that one of the things that will work is get them to understand the dictum that don't engage in harmful content and don't be provoked by it, because it's only when people get provoked by harmful content that it becomes possible to catalyze into violence. So I think these are some of my preliminary response to your question. Thank you very much.
Great. Can we do another question? There's one more.
Yes, good evening. Okay, it will be very fast. I like the idea of call to action, but if you ask somebody to take action, you have to show him maybe an example, Let's say harmful or hateful conversations on, I don't know where. I mean, on Twitter, on Facebook, on WhatsApp, and to show what is actually the content and what should be done. And so my question is whether you could, I mean, it's now too late, but how you would present such a finding, how you get to understand this conversation is hateful, and then how do you present it to the civil society and say, okay, this is an example and you should do something about it.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, that is a very important question, and maybe something we should have highlighted right at the beginning. It basically is captured within the principles that Sana was presenting. The idea that what we do, the work that we do, the sort of level of information that we're looking at as well is quite sensitive. So for us, it is, at this level, it's possible to share general findings and sort of invite the civil society to come and be part of this. But it's not the right stage to be sharing the detailed information. So that would exactly be the sort of circle that we want to open up for, to make sure that there can actually be a group of trusted partners that can come together. But of course, we have to respect the sensitivity of the subject and the existing partners that we work with on the ground as well. But I think the invitation basically is there to say, like, come be part of that conversation, be part of the vetted partners to engage in that space. For the rest, we do appreciate the sensitivity. So I guess we didn't take any questions. So thank you very much again, and yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.